Amanda Foster knew something was wrong when Ryan missed his call. On May 10, 2025, 24-year-old Ryan Mitchell and his 4 college friends embarked on what should have been a celebratory camping trip to mark their graduation from Oregon State University. Instead, it became one of the most horrific and unexplained mass killings in Pacific Northwest history, leaving investigators baffled and the public terrified of what might be lurking in the deep wilderness. What happened between sundown and sunrise still has no agreed-upon explanation. Ryan had been planning this trip for months as a way to celebrate the end of their environmental science program. The group consisted of his closest friends from university, Jessica Torres, 23, an aspiring wildlife photographer, Connor Walsh, 25, a former Army Ranger turned forestry student, Maya Patel, 22, an ecosystem conservation specialist, and Alex Kim, 24, a climate research enthusiast from Seattle. None of them knew they were walking into a place where something had been waiting. These 5 friends had formed an inseparable bond during their 4 years at Oregon State, united by their shared love of the outdoors and commitment to environmental protection. They had spent countless weekends exploring the wilderness areas of Oregon and Washington, from the volcanic peaks of the Cascades to the rugged coastline of the Pacific. But this time, the wilderness would be exploring them. Ryan, the unofficial leader of their outdoor adventures, had grown up in a family that valued both academic achievement and outdoor recreation. His parents had instilled in him a deep appreciation for the natural world and the importance of scientific research in understanding and protecting ecosystems. He'd prepared for everything but this. Jessica Torres had discovered her passion for wildlife photography during her freshman year. Her photographs had been featured in several environmental publications, and she had already received offers from National Geographic for internships following graduation. Her camera would capture their last moments of happiness, but nothing of what came after. Connor Walsh's path to environmental science had been unconventional. After serving 2 tours in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger, he had discovered his love of forestry during a wilderness therapy program. His military experience had made him the natural safety officer for their group. Even his combat training wouldn't be enough. Maya Patel had been passionate about environmental conservation since childhood, growing up in a family deeply involved in environmental activism in Portland. Her thesis research on climate change impacts on old-growth forests had earned recognition from her professors. She understood ecosystems better than most, but she didn't understand what lived in this one. Alex Kim had initially planned to study computer science, but switched to environmental science after taking a course on climate modeling. His analytical mind had made him particularly valuable in research projects requiring data analysis. His data would never account for what the forest was hiding. The destination they chose was a remote section of the Cascade Range, approximately 40 miles northeast of Bend, Oregon. The area was known for its pristine wilderness, ancient Douglas fir forests, and crystal-clear mountain lakes. More importantly, it was far from established campgrounds and popular hiking trails, offering complete solitude and untouched natural beauty. But solitude in the wilderness is never truly complete. Ryan had discovered the location during his thesis research on old-growth forest preservation. The area was so remote that it rarely saw human visitors. The nearest Forest Service road ended more than 4 miles away, and reaching their chosen campsite required a challenging hike through dense forest and rocky terrain. What they didn't know was that something else had been using these same trails for much longer. The group had spent weeks meticulously planning their 3-day expedition. They carried high-quality camping equipment, enough food for 4 days, advanced water purification systems, and multiple emergency communication devices, including satellite messengers and emergency beacons. None of their technology would save them from something that had learned to hunt in silence. They began their hike on Friday morning, May 10th, starting from a Forest Service road that ended at a small gravel parking area used primarily by hunters during deer season and the occasional researcher studying the remote ecosystem. The weather forecast was perfect for camping, with clear skies, mild temperatures in the 60s during the day and 40s at night, and no precipitation expected throughout the weekend. Their spirits were high as they shouldered their heavy packs, each weighing between 45 and 55 pounds, and made their way into the forest along a faint trail that was barely visible and clearly saw very little use. They didn't notice the much larger tracks that occasionally crossed their path. The hike to their chosen campsite took approximately 4.5 hours, significantly longer than they had initially estimated due to the challenging terrain, their heavy packs loaded with camping gear and scientific equipment, and several stops to rest and admire the spectacular scenery. The trail wound through dense stands of old-growth timber. Some trees over 300 feet tall and more than 500 years old crossed several rushing mountain streams, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, and climbed steadily through increasingly rugged terrain as they gained over 2,000 feet in elevation. The ancient trees had witnessed things that would have made the group turn back immediately. The location they had selected was a small natural clearing beside a pristine mountain lake, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and offering spectacular panoramic views of the surrounding peaks. The lake was approximately 200 yards across and appeared to be quite deep, with crystal clear water that reflected the surrounding mountains like a perfect mirror. The lake was fed by a small waterfall that cascaded down from the rocky cliffs above, creating a constant, gentle sound that would provide the perfect natural soundtrack for their wilderness retreat. The sound would also mask any approaching footsteps. It seemed like paradise as they set up their tents in a rough circle around a central area where they could cook and socialize. They followed leave-no-trace principles carefully, selecting tent sites that would minimize their impact on the fragile alpine vegetation and positioning their camp kitchen in an area where they could easily clean up and pack out all their waste. What they couldn't see were the eyes watching them from the tree line, learning their patterns. Friday evening passed like a perfect wilderness adventure that would be remembered fondly by anyone who survived to tell the tale. The group prepared an elaborate dinner over their portable camp stoves, sharing stories and laughter as they cooked together in the fading light. They had brought ingredients for a celebration feast, including fresh vegetables, premium steaks, and even a bottle of champagne that they had carefully packed in to mark their graduation. The smell of cooking food drifted far into the forest, reaching senses they never imagined were there. They built a small campfire using deadfall wood they had gathered from the surrounding forest, following leave-no-trace principles to minimize their impact on the pristine environment. The fire provided warmth and a focal point for their evening activities, and they spent hours sitting around it, sharing stories from their college years, discussing their hopes and dreams for the future, and simply enjoying the profound peace and beauty of their remote wilderness setting. The firelight made them visible from a great distance, but it also made everything beyond its glow invisible to them. Jessica took dozens of photographs of the sunset, reflecting off the lake's mirror-like surface, capturing images that would later become some of the last documentation of the group's happiness and excitement. The photographs showed 5 young people at the peak of their lives, celebrating their achievements and looking forward to bright futures filled with meaningful work and continued adventures in the natural world they loved so much. In several of the photos, if you looked carefully at the tree line, there were shadows that didn't quite match the trees. As darkness fell across the mountain wilderness, they followed proper wilderness camping protocols that Connor had drilled into them during their college adventures. All food was stored in bear-proof containers and hung from a tree branch well away from their sleeping area, following established guidelines to prevent attracting wildlife to their campsite. The campfire was completely extinguished with water and dirt, and they secured their campsite against potential encounters with bears, mountain lions, or other large predators known to inhabit the region. But their precautions were designed for animals that followed predictable patterns. The group retired to their tents around 10:30, with Ryan and Alex sharing a large 2-person tent, while Jessica, Maya, and Connor each had their own individual shelters. They had positioned the tents in a defensive circle around their central camping area, close enough for safety and communication, but far enough apart to provide some privacy and reduce noise between the shelters. The night was calm and peaceful, with only the gentle sounds of the waterfall, the lake lapping against the rocky shore, and the occasional call of a night bird or rustle of small animals moving through the forest. None of them heard the much larger sounds that had stopped just beyond the edge of their hearing. What happened during the early morning hours of May 11th would haunt investigators, search and rescue personnel, and the families of the victims for years to come. The attack occurred sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., based on later forensic analysis of the crime scene, and was swift, brutal, and completely silent. None of the campers had time to scream, call for help, activate their emergency beacons, or even emerge from their sleeping bags to defend themselves against their attacker. The precision and speed suggested something far beyond ordinary predatory behavior. The creature had apparently observed the campsite for some time before attacking, learning the layout of the tents and the sleeping patterns of the occupants. It had then moved through the campsite with surgical precision, killing each victim quickly and efficiently before moving on to the next tent. How long had it been watching them? The first indication that something was wrong came when the group failed to check in with their designated emergency contact as planned on Saturday evening. Ryan had arranged to call his girlfriend, Amanda Foster, every evening of the trip. When no call came by 9 p.m., Amanda initially assumed they were having equipment problems or had lost track of time enjoying their wilderness experience. She had no way of knowing that by then they had already been dead for 18 hours. By Sunday morning, when there was still no contact despite multiple attempts to reach them through various communication channels, Amanda became genuinely concerned. She knew Ryan was extremely responsible about safety protocols and would never fail to check in without good reason. She immediately contacted the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office to report the overdue party, providing them with detailed information about the group's planned route, campsite location, expected return date, and the emergency equipment they were carrying. What she couldn't tell them was that all their emergency equipment had been deliberately disabled. The initial search began Sunday afternoon with a helicopter flyover of the area, using the GPS coordinates that Ryan had provided before their departure. From the air, searchers could see the group's brightly colored tents still standing in the clearing beside the mountain lake, which initially seemed like a positive sign suggesting the campers were still at their planned location. However, when the helicopter crew attempted radio contact with the campers using emergency frequencies, there was no response despite multiple attempts. The helicopter crew noted several disturbing details during their aerial reconnaissance that immediately raised red flags about the situation below. There was no movement around the campsite, despite the noise of the aircraft overhead. No signs of normal camping activity, such as people moving between tents or cooking areas. And no response to their attempts to signal the campers using the helicopter's loudspeaker and searchlight. The scene looked peaceful from above, but something about the stillness felt wrong. A ground search team was dispatched immediately, consisting of experienced search and rescue volunteers, sheriff's deputies, a forensic specialist, and a wildlife expert. The team reached the campsite just before sunset on Sunday evening after a grueling 4-hour hike through increasingly difficult terrain that tested even their considerable wilderness experience. As they approached the clearing, the silence was the first thing they noticed. No birds, no insects, nothing. What they found there would traumatize even the most experienced first responders and become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Pacific Northwest history. All 5 tents were still standing and appeared completely undisturbed from a distance, with no obvious signs of struggle or damage visible from the perimeter of the campsite. However, as the search team approached more closely, they began to notice disturbing details that made their blood run cold. Dark stains were visible on the tent fabric, and an overwhelming smell of blood hung in the air, so strong that several team members became physically ill. The scene inside the tents was beyond anything the experienced search and rescue personnel had encountered in years of wilderness operations. Each victim had been killed while sleeping, apparently without warning, or any opportunity to defend themselves or escape from their shelters. The injuries were massive and appeared to have been inflicted by something with incredible strength and razor-sharp claws capable of tearing through both tent fabric and human bodies with terrifying ease. But what could kill 5 people without waking any of them? Ryan Mitchell was found in his sleeping bag, his body bearing wounds that indicated he had been struck by something with enormous force and surgical precision. The damage was so severe that initial investigators struggled to understand what kind of weapon or animal could have caused such devastating injuries. His tent mate, Alex Kim, showed similar wounds, and both appeared to have died instantly without any sign of struggle or attempt to escape their shelter. The silence of their deaths was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. Jessica Torres, the wildlife photographer, was discovered with her expensive camera equipment scattered around her tent, some of it damaged by what appeared to be massive claws. Investigators later found that her camera's memory card contained dozens of beautiful photographs from the previous day documenting their hike and campsite, but nothing from the night of the attack. Her injuries were consistent with those found on the other victims, suggesting the same perpetrator was responsible for all 5 deaths. The deliberate destruction of her camera equipment suggested intelligence and planning. Maya Patel and Connor Walsh, despite Connor's extensive military training and combat experience, had suffered the same fate as their friends. The speed and efficiency of the attack suggested that even Connor's Army Ranger training and survival skills had been completely useless against whatever had invaded their campsite during the night. Connor's tent showed evidence that he had at least partially awakened during the attack, as his sleeping bag was partially unzipped and his hand was near his knife, but he had not had time to defend himself or alert the others. The crime scene presented numerous puzzles that would confound investigators for months and challenge everything they thought they knew about wilderness predators. Despite the massive trauma inflicted on the victims, there was relatively little blood outside the tents themselves, suggesting that whatever had killed the campers had done so with surgical precision, avoiding the kind of widespread carnage that might be expected from such a violent attack. This wasn't the work of a mindless beast. But what was it? More disturbing were the tracks found around the campsite when investigators began their detailed forensic analysis. Mixed in with the boot prints left by the victims during their normal camping activities were footprints unlike anything in law enforcement databases or wildlife identification guides. The prints measured approximately 18 inches in length and 10 inches in width, with clear impressions of 5 toes and what appeared to be claw marks extending beyond the toe impressions. The depth and spacing of the mysterious tracks indicated something that walked upright on 2 legs but was much larger and heavier than any human being. The stride length suggested a creature at least 8 feet tall with a weight that forensic experts estimated at over 500 pounds based on the depth of the impressions in the soft forest soil. The tracks formed a clear pattern around the campsite, suggesting that the creature had circled the area multiple times before attacking, possibly observing the sleeping campers and planning its approach. Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic pathologist who examined the victims, had never encountered injuries like those found on the 5 campers, despite decades of experience with animal attacks, homicides, and wilderness accidents. The wounds showed characteristics that didn't match any known animal attack patterns in the scientific literature. The claw marks were too large and too precisely placed to have been made by bears, mountain lions, or any other predator native to the Oregon wilderness. The precision suggested something with human-like intelligence, but far greater physical power. The investigation expanded rapidly as news of the bizarre killings spread throughout law enforcement circles and attracted attention from federal agencies. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was called in to create a psychological profile of the perpetrator, while wildlife experts from across the Pacific Northwest were consulted about possible animal explanations for the attack. Traditional profiling methods seemed inadequate for something that might not be human. Dr. Michael Harrison, a leading expert on large predator behavior from the University of Washington, examined the crime scene evidence and concluded that no known animal could have been responsible for the killings. The precision of the attacks, the complete lack of feeding behavior that would be expected from a predatory animal, and the apparent intelligence shown in approaching multiple tents without alerting any of the victims all pointed to something outside the normal range of wildlife behavior. His final report raised more questions than it answered. The case took an even stranger turn when investigators discovered that the area where the attack occurred had a long and disturbing history of unexplained incidents. Local Native American tribes, particularly the Warm Springs and Confederated tribes of the Umatilla, had stories going back generations about dangerous creatures that lived in the deepest parts of the Cascade forests. These legends spoke of massive, hair-covered beings that were neither human nor animal, possessing incredible strength and intelligence, but also a capacity for violence that made them feared by even the most experienced hunters and warriors. More recently, there had been numerous reports from hikers, hunters, and Forest Service personnel of strange sounds echoing through the wilderness at night, unusual footprints found on remote trails, and brief sightings of large bipedal figures moving through the trees with impossible stealth and speed. Most of these reports had been dismissed by authorities as misidentifications of known animals, hoaxes, or the products of overactive imaginations, but the pattern of sightings created a disturbing context for the campsite murders. How many warnings had been ignored? The investigation team began systematically interviewing witnesses who had reported previous encounters in the region. Tom Bradley, a local hunting guide with 30 years of experience in the Cascade forests, described a disturbing incident from the previous fall when he had discovered a deer carcass that had been torn apart in a manner remarkably similar to the injuries found on the camping victims. Bradley explained that the deer had been killed with what appeared to be massive claws, but unlike typical predator kills where the animal would be consumed, there was no evidence of feeding. The kill seemed motivated by something other than hunger. Another witness, Maria Santos, a professional wildlife photographer who had been working in the Cascade wilderness for several years, reported multiple encounters with something she could only describe as a giant bipedal creature that seemed to possess human-like intelligence. She had managed to capture several blurry photographs of a large, dark figure moving through the trees, but the images were too unclear and distant to provide definitive proof of what she had seen. Her most disturbing observation was that the creature seemed to understand when it was being photographed. The forensic analysis of the campsite continued for weeks, with experts from multiple disciplines contributing to the investigation. Soil samples from around the tents revealed traces of an unknown organic compound that didn't match any substance in scientific databases, suggesting the presence of an unidentified biological entity. Hair samples found caught on tree branches near the campsite contained DNA that was similar to human genetic material, but with significant differences that suggested an unknown primate species. The DNA was human, but not. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a geneticist specializing in primate evolution at Portland State University, analyzed the hair samples and concluded that they came from a creature that was closely related to humans but represented a separate evolutionary branch. The genetic markers suggested a species that had diverged from the human lineage much more recently than any known primate, possibly within the last few 100,000 years, rather than millions of years ago, as with other great apes. Her findings challenged everything science thought it knew about human evolution, but they also raised a terrifying question: what else was sharing the continent with us? The implications of this genetic evidence were staggering and challenged fundamental assumptions about human evolution and the biodiversity of North American ecosystems. If accurate, it suggested that the Pacific Northwest was home to a population of unknown hominids that had somehow remained hidden from scientific discovery despite centuries of exploration and settlement. The evidence pointed to creatures that had evolved alongside humans but had chosen to remain hidden in the deepest wilderness areas. As news of the investigation inevitably leaked to the media, despite efforts to maintain secrecy, public interest in the case exploded into a national phenomenon. The story of 5 college graduates killed by an unknown creature in the Oregon wilderness captured international attention, with news crews, documentary filmmakers, and amateur investigators descending on the area despite law enforcement efforts to maintain security around the crime scene. The media circus only made the investigation more difficult, but it also brought forward witnesses who had been too afraid to speak before. The media attention brought forward additional witnesses who had previously been reluctant to report their own encounters with unknown creatures in the Pacific Northwest forests. The pattern of sightings and incidents that emerged painted a picture of a small but stable population of large, intelligent bipedal creatures that had been living in the most remote wilderness areas for generations, occasionally coming into contact with humans, but generally avoiding detection through superior knowledge of the terrain and remarkable stealth abilities. But the encounters were becoming more frequent and more violent. Dr. Robert Mitchell, Ryan's father and a respected professor of anthropology at the University of Oregon, became an unlikely advocate for serious scientific investigation of the creature responsible for his son's death. Despite his overwhelming grief and the personal tragedy that had destroyed his family, he recognized that the evidence pointed to a discovery that could revolutionize our understanding of human evolution and the hidden biodiversity of North American ecosystems. His pain drove him to seek answers that might prevent other families from suffering the same loss. The investigation officially remains open, with law enforcement agencies continuing to follow leads and analyze evidence while struggling with the unprecedented nature of the case. However, the remote location of the attack, the apparent intelligence of the perpetrator, and the lack of any clear trail to follow have made it extremely difficult to gather additional evidence or locate the creature responsible for the killings. Every lead seemed to vanish into the wilderness like morning mist. The families of the 5 victims have established a foundation dedicated to wilderness safety education and research into unknown species that may pose threats to outdoor enthusiasts. They hope that their loved ones' tragic deaths might ultimately lead to better understanding and protection for both humans and the mysterious creatures that share our wilderness areas, preventing future tragedies while advancing scientific knowledge. But their efforts are haunted by a single question: how do you protect people from something that science refuses to acknowledge exists? The campsite where Ryan Mitchell and his friends died has been permanently closed to public access, but the questions raised by their deaths continue to haunt investigators, researchers, and anyone who ventures into the deep wilderness. The case stands as a chilling reminder that even in our modern world of satellite imagery, GPS tracking, and advanced communication technology, there are still mysteries lurking in the wild places that we are only beginning to understand. The lake remains closed. Locals say the water still ripples at night. The 5 young graduates who set out to celebrate their bright futures and their shared love of the natural world instead became victims of something that science has yet to explain or classify. Their story serves as a sobering reminder that the wilderness still holds secrets that can turn a peaceful camping trip into a nightmare beyond imagination, and that there may be more sharing our world than we ever dared to believe. The most disturbing aspect remains the complete silence of their deaths and the surgical precision of the attack. What makes this case particularly haunting is the complete absence of any warning signs or defensive wounds on the victims, suggesting they were killed so quickly that they never had a chance to fight back or even wake up. The creature's ability to move silently through the campsite and dispatch 5 healthy young adults without alerting any of them speaks to a level of predatory skill that defies conventional understanding of animal behavior. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, it's still out there.